The Andes Mountains form the longest continental mountain range on Earth. They extend along the western edge of South America for more than 7,000 kilometers, crossing multiple climates and national borders. In central Chile and western Argentina, the range rises sharply, with peaks exceeding 6,000 meters. Snow remains year-round at high elevations. Weather changes without warning. In October 1972, the southern Andes were entering late spring. At lower altitudes, seasonal thaw had begun. At higher elevations, winter conditions persisted. Temperatures remained well below freezing, particularly at night. Wind was constant. Visibility could change within minutes. The terrain in this region is steep and fractured. Valleys are narrow. Slopes descend abruptly into glacial basins. Snowfields conceal rock and ice beneath a uniform surface. Navigation on foot is difficult even in favorable conditions. From the air, depth and distance are deceptive. Human presence in this section of the Andes is minimal. There are no permanent settlements at high altitude. Occasional mule paths exist at lower passes, but much of the interior remains untraveled. Search and rescue operations are limited by weather, terrain, and elevation. In the early 1970s, aerial detection depended on clear skies and visual identification. Sound behaves differently in thin air. Wind carries it away. Silence dominates for long periods, interrupted only by gusts or shifting snow. At altitude, physical exertion is immediately taxing. Breathing becomes shallow. Movement slows. This environment is indifferent. It does not respond to human intention or preparation. It imposes conditions that cannot be negotiated. Survival within it depends on adaptation, restraint, and time. On October 13, 1972, this landscape would become the unintended endpoint of a routine flight. But at first, the mountains remained unchanged. They stood as they had for centuries, without signal or warning. On the morning of October 12, 1972, a Fairchild FH-227D aircraft operated by the Uruguayan Air Force departed from Carrasco International Airport in Montevideo. The flight was designated Flight 571. Its destination was Santiago, Chile, with a planned stopover in Mendoza, Argentina. The aircraft was assigned to transport members of the Old Christians Club rugby team, along with friends, family members, and a small crew. The Old Christians Club was an amateur rugby team based in Montevideo. Most of its players were young men in their late teens and early 20s. They were students, recent graduates, or early in professional training. Rugby was central to their social life. The trip to Chile was organized for a friendly match against a local team in Santiago. It was intended to be brief and routine. The passenger list included 45 people. Among them were 19 members of the rugby team, relatives of players, and supporters. The flight crew consisted of 5 members, including an experienced pilot and co-pilot familiar with regional routes. The aircraft itself was a twin-turboprop transport plane used regularly by the Uruguayan Air Force for domestic and regional flights. Travel across the Andes by air was common but not without risk. Commercial jet routes existed, but smaller aircraft often relied on visual navigation and radio beacons. Weather conditions determined whether crossings were attempted or delayed. On October 12, poor weather over the mountains forced Flight 571 to land in Mendoza instead of continuing to Santiago. The passengers stayed overnight. The delay was unremarkable. The group lodged together and expected to resume travel the following day. There was no sense of urgency. No one anticipated deviation from the original plan beyond a minor inconvenience. On October 13, the weather appeared improved. The flight departed Mendoza in the early afternoon. The Andes lay to the west. The crossing would take less than an hour under normal conditions. The aircraft climbed steadily toward the mountain corridor assigned by air traffic control. At the time, nothing distinguished Flight 571 from dozens of similar crossings made each week. The passengers were calm. The crew followed standard procedures. The journey resumed as intended. The flight path from Mendoza to Santiago required aircraft to navigate a narrow corridor through the central Andes. Commercial jets typically flew at higher altitudes, well above the peaks. Smaller turboprop aircraft, such as the Fairchild FH-227, operated at lower cruising levels and relied on precise navigation to avoid terrain. In 1972, navigation across the Andes combined radio beacons, timing calculations, and visual confirmation. Ground-based aids were limited by line of sight. Pilots estimated position by tracking airspeed, wind, and elapsed time between known points. Errors accumulated gradually. Cloud cover reduced visual reference. The standard route from Mendoza involved climbing toward the Planchon Pass, then turning westward after clearing the highest ridges. From there, descent into the Santiago Basin followed. Weather often obscured the peaks, making altitude awareness critical. On October 13, cloud layers were present over the mountains. Reports suggested improving conditions, but visibility remained inconsistent. Winds at altitude were stronger than forecast. Such winds could alter ground speed and affect time-based navigation estimates. Flight 571 climbed to approximately 18,000 feet. The crew believed they had passed the main ridge of the Andes earlier than they actually had. Relying on timing calculations, they initiated a descent while still east of the highest terrain. The aircraft remained within cloud cover, preventing visual confirmation of surrounding peaks. Air traffic control in Santiago cleared the flight to descend, based on the crew's reported position. There was no independent radar tracking of the aircraft's exact location at that altitude and range. Communication depended on pilot reports. As the aircraft descended, the terrain beneath it rose sharply. The Andes in this region consist of overlapping ridgelines rather than a single crest. Without visual cues, distinguishing between eastern foothills and the main range was difficult. The margin for error narrowed. At reduced altitude, there was little room for correction. The aircraft continued westward into unseen terrain. What had been a routine crossing became dependent on a single assumption, that the mountains were already behind them. They were not. At approximately 3:34 p.m. on October 13, 1972, Flight 571 emerged briefly from cloud cover. The crew saw a mountain slope rising directly ahead. There was no time to climb. The aircraft was already descending. The pilot applied full power and attempted to gain altitude. The response was immediate but insufficient. The left wing struck the ridge first. It was torn away on impact. The aircraft spun, and the tail section separated moments later. The fuselage continued forward, uncontrolled. Passengers were thrown violently. Several were ejected through the open rear section where the tail had detached. The remaining body of the aircraft slid down a steep snow-covered slope. It traveled hundreds of meters before coming to rest in a glacial valley at approximately 3,570 meters above sea level. The fuselage came to rest upright, embedded in snow. The cockpit and forward section were crushed. Both pilots were killed on impact. Several passengers died immediately from trauma. Others were seriously injured. Outside, debris was scattered across the slope. Pieces of the aircraft lay partially buried in snow. The detached wings were no longer visible. The tail section rested far upslope, unreachable without equipment. Inside the fuselage, the survivors were surrounded by wreckage, bodies, and loose cargo. Seats had torn from their mounts. Luggage and structural components filled the narrow space. The temperature dropped rapidly. There was no fire. No explosion followed the crash. The absence of fuel ignition prevented additional loss of life. The surrounding terrain offered no clear route of escape. Steep walls of rock and snow enclosed the valley. Peaks rose in all directions. The crash site was invisible from below and difficult to distinguish from the air. Within minutes, the aircraft was silent. The engines had stopped. Wind moved across the snow outside. The survivors remained at high altitude, injured, exposed, and without communication. At that moment, they were unaware of their exact location. They did not know how far they were from populated areas. They did not know that their descent had ended deep within the Andes, east of their intended route. The point of return had passed. The survivors who remained conscious gathered inside the broken fuselage as daylight faded. The aircraft body provided the only protection available. Outside, the temperature dropped quickly. Wind moved through the valley without obstruction. Snow reflected the remaining light, then darkness settled. The fuselage was incomplete. The tail section was missing, leaving the rear open. Cold air entered continuously. Seats, insulation panels, and luggage were repositioned to block the opening as much as possible. This barrier was imperfect, but it reduced exposure. Several passengers were unable to move due to injuries. Fractures were common. Internal injuries were suspected but could not be treated. There were no medical supplies beyond a small first aid kit. Pain was managed without medication in most cases. The group took inventory of available materials. Food supplies consisted of a limited number of chocolate bars, wine bottles, and small snacks brought for the trip. There was no cooking equipment. Snow surrounded the fuselage, but there was no immediate method to melt it for water. The altitude affected everyone. Breathing was shallow. Physical exertion caused rapid fatigue. Headaches and nausea appeared within hours. Sleep was difficult due to cold, pain, and limited space. The survivors organized themselves informally. Those with fewer injuries assisted others. The dead were moved aside to create room. This was done without ceremony. Space was required for the living. During the first night, temperatures inside the fuselage fell well below freezing. Clothing was layered. Bodies were pressed together to conserve heat. Movement was minimized. At dawn, the surroundings became visible. Snow-covered mountains enclosed the valley on all sides. No vegetation was present. No signs of human activity were visible. The wreckage stood out sharply against the white terrain. The fuselage became a fixed point in the landscape. It was not a place of safety, but it was shelter. Leaving it without equipment or clear direction posed immediate risk. For the moment, survival depended on staying where they were. The second day after the crash brought a clearer assessment of their situation. The food recovered from the wreckage was minimal. A small number of chocolate bars, several packets of crackers, and a few bottles of wine were all that could be found. There were no fresh provisions. No emergency rations were stored on the aircraft. Rationing began immediately. Portions were reduced to the smallest possible amounts. The food was distributed evenly, without regard to age or strength. Each person received only enough to delay hunger, not satisfy it. There was no certainty about how long the supplies would need to last. Water was not available in liquid form. Snow surrounded the fuselage, but consuming it directly caused discomfort and increased the risk of hypothermia. The group improvised a method to melt snow using metal fragments and sunlight. This process was slow and produced limited quantities. Each cup of water required time and attention. Days were marked by light rather than clocks. Watches had stopped or were removed to conserve movement. Time was estimated by sunrise and sunset. Night lasted longer than day at altitude. The cold intensified after dusk. On the 9th day, a small battery-powered radio was discovered among the luggage. It functioned intermittently. The survivors gathered closely to listen. News reports confirmed that search operations were underway. Aircraft were scanning the Andes. Hope was cautious but present. Several days later, another broadcast was received. The search had been suspended. The authorities believed there were no survivors. The crash site had not been located. The information altered priorities. Remaining food was redistributed again. Rations were reduced further. The group understood that rescue would not arrive quickly, if at all. Energy conservation became essential. Movement outside the fuselage was limited. Tasks were assigned only when necessary. Conversation decreased. Hunger and cold dominated attention. The landscape remained unchanged. Snow reflected sunlight during the day and released cold at night. There was no visible route downward. No signs of life. Time continued without markers. Days merged into one another. Survival shifted from waiting to endurance. As days passed, the physical effects of altitude and cold became more pronounced. Weight loss was visible. Faces thinned. Movements slowed further. Minor injuries healed poorly. Infections developed where wounds could not be properly cleaned. The survivors adjusted their routines to reduce strain. Tasks were simplified. Snow was melted only during daylight when sunlight made the process marginally more efficient. Clothing was dried inside the fuselage using body heat. Wet fabric increased heat loss and was avoided whenever possible. The interior of the fuselage was reorganized again. Seating positions became fixed. Each person occupied a defined space to minimize movement and conserve warmth. Shoes were removed and shared when necessary. Insulation from the aircraft walls was stripped and repurposed to block drafts. Altitude sickness affected concentration. Simple decisions required time. Standing caused dizziness. Several individuals remained lying down for most of the day. There was no effective treatment beyond rest and hydration, both of which were limited. The group established informal leadership based on capability rather than hierarchy. Those with medical training, however limited, assisted the injured. Others focused on structural improvements to the shelter. Roles were not assigned formally but emerged through necessity. Outside excursions were attempted cautiously. A few survivors climbed short distances up the surrounding slopes to gain visibility. The effort was exhausting. Each step sank into snow. The thin air limited progress. No clear path out of the valley was identified. The mountains appeared continuous in all directions. Nighttime was the most difficult period. Temperatures dropped sharply. Breathing became labored in the cold air. Sleep occurred in short intervals. The absence of darkness inside the fuselage made rest irregular. Mental strategies shifted. Conversation focused on practical matters. Memories of home were mentioned less frequently. Attention narrowed to immediate needs, warmth, water, and remaining food. Speculation about rescue diminished. Adaptation did not improve conditions. It only slowed decline. The environment imposed limits that could not be altered. The survivors remained alive through restraint, cooperation, and incremental adjustment. By the third week, it was clear that remaining at the crash site indefinitely would not lead to rescue. The question of leaving the fuselage began to surface, cautiously and without consensus. On October 29, 1972, 16 days after the crash, weather conditions changed abruptly. Snowfall increased during the afternoon and continued into the night. Wind intensified. Visibility dropped to near zero. The survivors remained inside the fuselage, as they had during previous storms. Shortly after midnight, a low sound emerged from the slope above them. It was not immediately identifiable. Seconds later, a mass of snow and ice broke free and descended directly into the valley. The avalanche struck the fuselage with full force. Snow entered through the open rear and crushed inward. The interior space filled rapidly. Several survivors were buried where they lay. Others were pinned beneath debris and snow. Breathing became difficult almost immediately. When the movement stopped, the fuselage was completely buried except for a small section near the cockpit. Darkness was total. Air was limited. Panic was suppressed by necessity rather than control. Those who could move began digging with their hands, following voices and sounds. The process took hours. Snow was compacted and heavy. Movement caused further collapse. One by one, survivors were freed. Not all were reached in time. 8 people died as a result of the avalanche. Some suffocated. Others succumbed to injuries aggravated by pressure and cold. Among the dead were individuals who had survived the initial crash and subsequent weeks. When daylight returned, the fuselage remained buried. The rear opening was sealed by snow. The interior temperature stabilized slightly due to insulation, but air circulation was poor. A small ventilation hole was created through the roof using metal fragments. The psychological impact was immediate and lasting. The shelter, once fragile but functional, had become a trap. Space was further reduced. Movement was restricted. The dead could not be removed and remained inside for several days. After the avalanche, the group's numbers were reduced to 27. Physical strength declined further. Morale did not collapse, but it narrowed. Survival became a confined, internal process. The environment had asserted itself again, without warning or intent. In the days following the avalanche, conditions inside the fuselage worsened. Space was limited to a narrow cavity carved from snow and metal. Movement was restricted to crawling. Air circulation depended on a single opening cut through the roof. It required constant maintenance to prevent blockage. Physical decline accelerated. Several survivors were unable to stand. Muscle loss was visible. Hands and feet showed signs of frost damage. Persistent coughing and chest pain suggested respiratory stress caused by cold air and altitude. Deaths continued. Some survivors succumbed to injuries sustained during the crash or avalanche. Others weakened gradually and stopped responding. When death occurred, it was quiet. The bodies remained inside the fuselage due to frozen ground and lack of strength to move them outside. Time became difficult to track. Days were counted by agreement rather than certainty. The routine of melting snow, adjusting insulation, and maintaining the ventilation hole repeated without variation. Hunger was constant. Weakness limited speech. Silence became common. Psychological pressure increased but did not manifest as panic. Instead, attention narrowed further. Decisions were reduced to immediate survival tasks. Long-term planning felt abstract. Discussions about leaving the site became more direct, driven by necessity rather than optimism. Several attempts were made to assess the terrain beyond the fuselage. When weather permitted, small groups emerged briefly. Each attempt confirmed the same conclusion: remaining at the crash site would not lead to rescue. The aircraft was invisible from above unless directly overhead. Search operations were unlikely to resume. By early December, the number of survivors had decreased to 16. Their physical condition was marginal. Energy reserves were nearly exhausted. The margin between survival and death had narrowed to days rather than weeks. At this stage, staying became a greater risk than leaving. The decision to attempt a crossing was no longer theoretical. It was the only remaining option. By mid-December, it was clear that waiting for rescue was no longer viable. 2 survivors, Fernando Nando Paradu and Roberto Canessa, volunteered to leave the fuselage and search for help. Their decision was based on physical condition, observation of terrain, and the realization that survival required reaching inhabited areas. On December 12, 1972, they began their trek. They carried minimal supplies: small portions of chocolate, condensed milk, and water collected from melted snow. Clothing was layered for maximum insulation, and metal fragments from the aircraft were used as tools when necessary. Footwear was improvised to reduce frostbite risk. The route was steep and largely uncharted. They climbed higher along ridgelines to gain vantage points. Snow and ice slowed progress. Navigation relied on visual observation, slope assessment, and memory of mountain shapes visible from the fuselage. Every movement demanded energy conservation and precision. After days of climbing, the survivors identified a distant valley to the west. This provided a possible route downward. Conditions remained harsh. The thin air limited stamina. Altitude sickness persisted. Injuries slowed movement. Sleep was brief, often in shallow depressions to shield from wind. After 10 days of continuous trekking, Paradou and Canessa descended to a lower valley where signs of human activity became evident. They encountered a Chilean shepherd, who alerted local authorities. From that point, organized rescue operations were initiated. The remaining 14 survivors were extracted from the crash site over the following days. Helicopters reached the fuselage location, and survivors were evacuated to medical facilities. All had suffered significant weight loss, frostbite, and illness, but they were alive. The crossing itself was not dramatic. It was a methodical, disciplined progression through terrain that allowed no error. The success was contingent on observation, planning, and endurance rather than external intervention. By December 23, 1972, the last survivors were accounted for. 72 days had passed since the crash. The final evacuation concluded quietly. 14 survivors were brought to medical facilities in Santiago and Montevideo. They were treated for injuries including fractures, frostbite, dehydration, and malnutrition. Weight loss averaged over half of their pre-crash body weight. Recovery was prolonged, but all who survived the trek returned to life outside the mountains. The crash claimed 29 lives in total. Injuries from impact, the avalanche, and the harsh environment accounted for these losses. Death was methodical and largely dictated by circumstance rather than neglect or action. The survivors did not celebrate, they absorbed the experience silently, as a record of endurance under extreme conditions. Historically, the incident became known as the 1972 Andes flight disaster. It remains one of the most documented cases of human survival in high-altitude, isolated terrain. The methods employed, use of wreckage for shelter, rationing, adaptation to altitude, and cautious traversal of the mountains, are cited in survival training and research. The story of Flight 571 illustrates the limits of human endurance when confronted by natural isolation and extreme conditions. The Andes proved indifferent to preparation, hope, or planning. Survival was neither heroic nor miraculous in the conventional sense. It was the outcome of pragmatic, persistent adaptation over 72 days. The mountains remain unchanged. Snow continues to fall, ridges rise and fall, and the valley where the fuselage rested is quiet. For those who endured, the event left a lasting imprint. For the mountains, it passed without recognition. Silence returned to the slopes as it had before October 13, 1972. The experience remains a historical record of human survival, a testament to restraint, cooperation, and a measured response to circumstance.